On February 27th in the year 1505, the King of Portugal, Manuel I, called for a grand assembly. There he wanted to announce his new plan for the conquest of the Indian Ocean. The upper echelon of society quickly congregated into the sovereign's presence to hear his audacious strategy, which would be known as the regimento. From the crowd, two men emerged and approached the king as they were commanded. They were father and son. The older man, Francisco de Almeida, was in his mid-50s. He was a formidable figure who had distinguished himself many times on the field of battle. The younger man, Lourenço de Almeida, Francisco's only son, was in his mid-20s. He was dashing and handsome, intelligent and resourceful. Most of all, he was eager to prove himself to his king, to his country, but especially to his father. The king then brought Francisco closer, and there, in front of this distinguished entourage, he proclaimed him the first viceroy of India, essentially the king's proxy. Lourenço, who was standing a few feet behind, watched with pride and absolute awe of his father as he was granted so high a title. It was later, after the fanfare had ended, that the two men, along with the rest of the high nobility, were ushered into a private chamber where the king began to outline his plan in detail. It was an absolutely bold strategy that bordered on outright arrogance, but it showed that the Portuguese insight into the world of the Indian Ocean was indeed impressive. In less than 1 decade, the Iberian Kingdom had obtained vast amounts of knowledge into the commerce, the vital ports, and the politics of the East. And now King Manuel I was ready to exploit that knowledge. Portugal was not out to simply just trade anymore. It was determined to establish an empire. The regimento would unfold in several stages. Francisco de Almeida was first ordered to take the Swahili coast in East Africa. There he would establish a series of forts at critical port cities where the trade routes of Africa ended. Kilwa, Sofala, Mombasa, Malindi, the list went on. Then the viceroy was instructed to secure allies along the coast of India with another series of forts. Anjadiva, Chal, Kannur, Kolom, Cochin. Again, the list went on. It was at this point that Gaspar da Gama, the godson of Vasco da Gama, who was at this point regarded as a veteran of Portuguese expansion, a man who had considerable knowledge of the Indian Ocean, not to mention the king's ear, interjected. He convinced King Manuel I that he also needed to go for the heart of Islamic trade. Therefore, blockading the Red Sea where it bottlenecks at its southern end and thereby cutting off all trade to Cairo and Mecca became an extremely high priority in the regimento. Of course, the holy war against Islam would also continue unabated. King Manuel would say to Almeida, "All India should be stripped of the illusion of being able to trade with anyone but ourselves. Expel the Muslims, and if not, wage total war and destruction on them by any means you can on land and sea, so that everything possible is destroyed." In later phases of the Grand Plan, fleets of Portuguese ships would be sent in to patrol the waters and extract annual tribute. Almeida was then ordered to seek out new life and new civilization by pushing the final frontiers of Portugal beyond the subcontinent of India. Ceylon, Malacca, Japan, China, yet again the list went on. As Roger Crowley would put it, it was a mission of war disguised as peace. King Manuel's ambition was enormous. He was convinced it was simply his divine right that this would all be accomplished. Of course, the man he picked for the job was the perfect choice. Roger Crowley, in his book The Conquerors, explains, quote, Almeida was to be the first member of high nobility to lead an India expedition. He was about 55 years old with wide military, diplomatic, and nautical experience. But he also possessed the personal qualities that King Manuel hoped for. Almeida was incorruptible. He was unmoved by the lure of riches. He was benevolent, a widower without ties to home, pious, and mature in his judgments. For many, the attraction of India was the prospect of personal gain. Almeida, on the other hand, was untarnished by the appetites of lesser men. He valued titles above bales of spice. And, most importantly, he knew how to fight. End quote. On March 25, 1505, the new Viceroy of India walked down a triumphant procession with his son. As they made their way, the king and the aristocracy gave them their blessing. Both father and son were impressively dressed for the occasion. It was a clear message to everyone: the Almeida family would be commanding this voyage. The Armada set out from Lisbon. It was massive, 21 ships with over 1,500 men. It was so big that even a few women managed to sneak on board. At the helm were experienced sailors and captains. Some had already made the India run before. Among the crews was Gaspar da Gama, who had joined the voyage to add his experience. But also included in the roster was one Ferdinand Magellan, who was there to gain experience. This, by the way, was the very same man who would one day get the credit for being the first to circumnavigate the world, albeit he did it under a different flag and, well, for another country. The Portuguese Armada passed the coast of northwest Africa before beginning its looping maneuver to the southwest. On the way to Brazil, however, a ship was lost to storms. Moving through the South Atlantic and braving the dangerous high-pressure zones that were there, the rest of the ships managed to round the Cape of Good Hope in late June. The Armada then rounded the tip of Africa and made its way north into the Mozambique Channel. On July 22, 1505, it arrived at Kilwa. Kilwa was a prize. It was a beautiful city. It was a major hub where the trade routes to East Africa ended. Its busy port also conducted commerce with Arabia, Persia, and with the Gujarati cities in distant India. Gold, cotton, cloth, incense, silver, gems, and of course, in its time, the most precious substance in the universe, spice, were commonplace on its wharfs. Now, 3 years prior, Vasco da Gama had come to the city. At that time, he demanded that the Sultan pay a hefty tribute and fly the Portuguese flag from its tallest tower. However, when Francisco arrived, the tribute had not been paid for 2 years, and there was no flag to be seen. This made the Viceroy, well, unhappy, and he demanded an immediate audience. The Sultan, in response, gave him a really weak excuse. Thus, 2 days later, on July 24th at dawn, Francisco Almeida stepped down from his ship adorned in his finest suit of armor, holding the Portuguese flag in one hand and a sword in the other. At the head of his troops, he uttered the word, "Attack," and with that, his men surged forward. Francisco smiled and looked on with pride as he watched his son Lourenço lead a contingent of men into the heart of the city. There they pillaged and destroyed as they went, brushing aside all resistance. When they arrived at the palace, they found it empty. The Sultan had already fled. The Portuguese then began to loot the city. The king's share, of course, was sent back to Lisbon. Over the next 2 weeks, an impressive fort was built in the city, built of stone, ironically taken from the houses that they had just destroyed. A garrison was assigned, a puppet ruler was put in place, and with that, the first objective of the regimento had been accomplished. With Kilwa secured, Francisco Almeida deployed some of his ships south to take Sofala. There, they would rendezvous with a fresh incoming Portuguese fleet. That city would eventually be taken and another fort would be constructed. With the acquisition of Sofala, the Portuguese would have one more impressive hub of the East African trade. Now, for the Viceroy and his Armada, it was time to move on. King Manuel's plan now called for the Viceroy to head directly to India. However, Francisco had decided that he wanted to secure one more foothold in Africa before he left. Mombasa had always been a thorn in the side of the Portuguese, and now it was outright hostile. Like Kilwa and Sofala, it was a major hub of trade which had grown rich and powerful. The Sultan had encountered the Portuguese before. He had wisely prepared for their return. The defenses of the city were fortified, cannons were brought in and installed, and a large garrison was put in place. As Almeida entered into the harbor, which, by the way, was one of the finest in East Africa, the Sultan of Mombasa opened fire with his cannons. In that first shot, he got really lucky. The salvo hit the lead ship and gouged a massive hole in the upper deck, killing all the men inside. However, for the Sultan, it was going to be all downhill from there. The Portuguese Armada came alive and returned fire. One fortunate cannonball somehow managed to penetrate through the city walls and hit Mombasa's powder magazine. The catastrophic explosion that ensued rattled the ground like an earthquake and silenced the city's artillery. What happened next was truly a test of willpower. The Sultan had an army of over 4,000 men at his command, and he was determined to hold his ground. Francisco de Almeida, on the other hand, had the initiative, and he was just as determined to take the city. Thus, the Armada was ordered to move in for the kill. As it approached the city, it began to unload its soldiers, and then the great assault began. Fighting was intensely fierce in the narrow passageways and small corridors. The Sultan's men fought heroically, street to street, house to house. Almeida, seeing his men and his offensive begin to falter, came up with a new tactic. He had his men roll barrels of gunpowder down from the ships. He then ordered the gunpowder to be placed into various buildings in the city upwind from his opponent. When the powder was ignited, fires broke out. The wind then carried the flames toward the Sultan and his men, and soon all of Mombasa was engulfed in a firestorm. A chronicler of the time who witnessed the event would comment, quote, "The fire that ran throughout the city burned all that afternoon and into the night that followed. It seemed as if the whole city was on fire. There was enormous destruction. The wooden houses burned to the ground, and those of stone and mortar caught fire and crashed down as well, and in them great riches and people were destroyed." End quote. Despite this, the Sultan fought on. At one point, he even had his men release wild elephants to stampede the men of Portugal. But Almeida had already turned the tide. For him, it was always about victory at any cost. The very next day, he deployed his men into a devastating four-pronged assault against the defenders of the city. His plan worked perfectly, and the Sultan of Mombasa was forced to run. A few days later, when the dust had settled, envoys were sent back and forth between the two men, and a peace treaty was struck. Mombasa was now firmly under the jurisdiction of the Portuguese. Its fine harbor was part of the empire. What's more, the Sultan would have to pay a massive tribute. But even before the ink was dry on the treaty, the plunder had begun. Almeida wisely divided the great city into areas, one for each of his captains. The subsequent pillaging was especially vicious, but it was efficient. When the Europeans were done, there was almost nothing left. In a letter that he wrote to the King of Malindi, the Sultan of Mombasa would lament, quote, "I will have you know that a great lord passed here, burning with fire. He entered the city so forcefully and cruelly that he spared the life of none, man or woman, young or old, or children, no matter how small. Not only were men killed and burned, but the birds of heaven fell to the earth. In this city, the stench of death is such that I dare not enter, and none could give account or assess the infinite wealth that he took." End quote. On August 23, 1505, Almeida left Africa. Sofala, Kilwa, Mombasa were all taken. Malindi remained a faithful ally. The viceroy had left behind him a path of death and destruction, but his focus was what lay ahead, and there before him was the path to India. The Portuguese position in India at this time was precarious at best. Portugal only had a few settlements, one in Kannur, another in Colombo, and a fort in Cochin, which, by the way, only escaped a narrow destruction through the genius of its defense by Duarte Pacheco Pereira the year before. Many cities remained hostile, including Diu, Dabur, Chal, and especially the great rival, Calicut. Francisco de Almeida got right to work after arriving along the Malabar coast in late August of 1505. He initially arrived at Anjadiva Island, which was a watering stop for ships conducting trade along the coast, and there he began construction of another fort. 1 month later, as the fort was nearing completion, Francisco decided to move south to the city of Onovar. But there, a disagreement with its Raja over a shipload of horses spiraled out of control and broke out into a massive fight. Violence spilled out across the entire city. The viceroy at one point was hit in the foot with an arrow, and so he looked to his son to finish the job. Lourenço was deployed with his men. For him, it was a chance to really prove himself. But taking a page from his own father, half the city was laid to waste before the young Almeida emerged victorious, though he did come close to dying a few times along the way. From the locals, he gained the nickname the Devil for how fierce, some would argue how reckless, his attacks were. But that said, the shock and awe worked. The Raja of Anavar sued for peace. An annual tribute was imposed. The Raja just didn't want to see that level of aggression from Iberian men that he now thought were somewhat insane. Now, during the assault, several ships were damaged or destroyed in the harbor. Some of these belonged to a prominent pirate named Timoji. This man had encountered Vasco da Gama before and knew how powerful the Portuguese could be, but seeing firsthand the destruction at Anavar, the pirate decided it would be in his best interest to give his allegiance to Portugal. From that time onwards, he would serve as a major informant. Remember the name. With things settled at Anavar, the viceroy made his way south to the port city of Canor, where he feared a merchant uprising would undermine Portuguese authority. His very presence, along with his armada, changed the mood quickly. In a week-long stay, he met several times with the Kolatiri Raja and began preparations for a fortress there, along with a garrison to man it. During his time in Canor, delegations and envoys from other cities would also meet up with Francisco, where they'd enter into negotiations to open up even new ports to the Europeans. Now, in early November of 1505, Almeida found himself in Cochin, which was to be a cornerstone of the Portuguese Empire. There, he met up with the new Trimampara Raja. The prior one, who had fought at the siege of Cochin, had already retired. The two men's first order of business was to expand and upgrade the fort at the mouth of the harbor. Roger Crawley would say, rulers up and down the Malabar coast were to find that once the Franks were ensconced behind solid ramparts, with artillery mounted on stout gun platforms, they proved almost impossible to dislodge. For the rest of 1505, Almeida and his son would turn their attention to ravaging Muslim shipping along the Malabar coast. The destruction they handed out was impressive. In response, the Arabian captains diverted their ships down to the Maldives. Their hope was that they could get around the Armada. Of course, the viceroy was not going to let that slide. Lourenço de Almeida was sent by his father to cut off this route. However, the water currents in this area were unknown to the Portuguese and would carry his fleet far to the east. There, Lourenço would be the first man of his country to make landfall in Ceylon, that is modern-day Sri Lanka. Like his father, he went right to work. He established a treaty with the local Raja, began trade negotiations, and laid down an early settlement. His diplomatic initiative was so good that 12 years later, a Portuguese fortress would also be added. In the final months of 1505, Francisco turned his attention to loading his ships with spice for the return journey. Even the aging Carac, the Flor de la Mar, was filled to capacity. The haul that the viceroy sent back to Lisbon was one of the greatest King Manuel would ever see. The yield in terms of cash was astronomical. Almeida had accomplished many of the goals of the Regimento, only the full blockade of the Red Sea was lacking, something, by the way, that would come back to haunt him on several levels. But despite his hard work, his efforts would go largely unappreciated. Back in Lisbon, the intrigue of the Portuguese court was turning against the viceroy. There were those in the nobility that were consumed with greed, jealousy, or simply malevolence. Several members of the high aristocracy had come forth to turn the king's favor away from Francisco de Almeida. In fact, by February of 1506, King Manuel had already chosen a replacement and had begun to view Almeida with suspicion. Early that year, Alfonso de Albuquerque, who had gained the king's confidence, was dispatched with a powerful fleet. In his hand, he carried a letter from the king, which granted him the title of governor and effectively ended the viceroy's time in power. Meanwhile, back in the Indian Ocean, the beginning of 1506 saw Francisco de Almeida hit a high point, yet he knew that trouble was brewing. The Zamorin of Calicut, also known as the Samudri Raja, who happened to be the biggest rival of the Portuguese, had sent a fleet to Canor to blockade the harbor. In March of 1506, Lourenço de Almeida sailed in. There he annihilated the Zamorin's fleet. But despite this victory, confidence in Portuguese supremacy was waning. Arab shipping, after all, was still getting through, the navies of the Indian Ocean were using more cannons, and new enemies were emerging. In the north, the Sultan of Bijapur, who owned the city of Dabul, was not happy with the Portuguese fortress at Anjadiva, which, to be fair, was intruding on the commerce of his city. In a well-timed and coordinated attack just before the monsoons came, the Sultan bombarded the fortress, shelled the people inside, and destroyed 3 nearby ships. His assault went unopposed for several days, and the garrison was at his mercy. Roger Crowley explained what happened next. Quote, Lourenço was dispatched and forced a withdrawal of the Sultan's ships, but it was clear that the fort was unsustainable, too close to hostile Bijapur, too short of natural resources. At the end of the year, Almeida took the decision, without reference to manual, to abandon and dismantle the structure. It was a riposte to the wisdom of the grand plan, and it did not go down well. At the same time, it gave hope to Muslim merchants that the Portuguese could indeed be dislodged. End quote. The story of Anjadiva empowered Portugal's enemies, who were all just waiting for the chance to strike. That strike would come sooner than Francisco anticipated. It was towards the end of 1506 when Lourenço was leading a fleet of ships towards the city of Chal. They had stopped along the way to dismantle the Anjadiva fort. Suddenly, they were approached by merchants from Cochin and Kannur, their allies. The merchants stated that their ships, laden down with spice, had been blockaded into the harbor of the city of Dabul by the ships of Arabia and Calicut. They demanded that the Portuguese live up to their reputation, sail in, and help them immediately. Lourenço wanted to rush in, but he was under orders to have a meeting with his captains to vote on the course of action. After a very heated debate, the final tally was 6-4 not to attack. It was argued that the harbor of Dabul was not well known, and this could all simply be a trap. The young Almeida was forced to agree with the decision, but he made all the captains sign their vote. Thus, their names were recorded. The book Conquerors describes the aftermath of this fateful decision. Quote, The inevitable happened. The friendly merchantmen were sacked, their crews killed, and their valuable cargo confiscated. The ships of Calicut fired mocking shots as they sailed away. For the first time, the Portuguese had flunked a fight. The refusal to protect their ships was taken badly in friendly Malabar ports. Not to mention, Francisco de Almeida was appalled by the news. End quote. All along the Malabar coast, the Portuguese position was now in jeopardy. Allies went cold, envoys ceased coming, and there were demands by the locals to go back to trading only with the ships of Mecca, which, if nothing else, had been reliable in the past. Indeed, even a major revolt broke out in Kannur in 1507 with anti-Portuguese sentiment, which, by the way, needed a considerable amount of resources to put down. Now, when news of this got back to Lisbon, the viceroy's opponents in the royal court had a field day, and saying that the king was displeased was an understatement. Francisco de Almeida rounded up all the men who had voted not to attack at Dabul. This included his son. All of these men were court-martialed. Some were sent back to Europe in utter disgrace, labeled as cowards. Others were imprisoned. When it came to Lourenço, the viceroy just couldn't get himself to sign the order to have him banished. Perhaps it was simply nepotism, or perhaps he just couldn't bear the thought of seeing his only son go. Instead, Lourenço was stripped of command and demoted. As the young man walked past his father, he just couldn't get himself to meet his gaze. The sense of failure and regret, of letting down the one man whose opinion mattered most, was just too much for him to bear. The young Almeida was placed in charge of a small flotilla and given convoy duty. He resigned himself to his fate, but every fiber of his being longed for redemption. The thought consumed him. For 1 full year, Lourenço did his duty, but he kept looking for a chance to redeem himself in his father's eyes. In March of 1508, Lourenço de Almeida found himself in the port city of Chal, which was not exactly a friendly port. Now, little did he, or for that matter his father, know, but approximately 200 miles to the northwest in the city of Diu was a massive Muslim armada. It had been built in the shipyards of the Mamluk Sultanate, traveled down the Red Sea, and had managed to evade all Portuguese ships. The Mamluk Armada had been in the Indian Ocean for months, and no one in the Portuguese High Command knew anything about it. When spies reported that the Viceroy's son was in Chaul and only had a handful of ships, it was way too tempting a target. The Muslim Armada immediately set sail for Chaul. Lourenço de Almeida would get his chance for redemption, and he would pay for it with his own blood.